I love you so much. Forever, my darling.
Springfield, Massachusetts, a quiet suburb, wide streets, well-kept lawns, and the smell of coffee in the morning. Margaret was 60 years old, with gray hair elegantly tied back and a serenity that concealed storms. She had lived alone since her husband passed away, but her son Daniel visited often, now accompanied by his young girlfriend Emily, a 25-year-old art teacher. Emily had a smile that lit up the house, and something about her brought out a vitality that Margaret thought she had left in the past. The first days were normal. Family dinners, conversations about work, long Sundays filled with laughter. But over time, Margaret noticed that her gaze lingered too long on Emily, on the way she moved her hair, the gentle way she said thank you, her easy laugh. Emily also began to notice. When her mother-in-law spoke, her eyes seemed to search for something, a secret perhaps. It was a silent energy, almost imperceptible, but it made the air feel denser. For 30 days, this game of glances continued. At Sunday lunches, their hands touched by accident. On winter evenings, serving wine in the living room, the silence spoke louder than any conversation. One night, Daniel had to travel for work, and Emily stayed at Margaret's house. Rain beat against the window, and the clock showed almost midnight. Margaret appeared at the bedroom door with a cup of tea in her hands. Margaret, I couldn't sleep. I thought tea might help. May I come in? Emily, of course, come in. I can't sleep either when it rains like this. Margaret sits on the edge of the bed. You know, it's strange. The house feels different when Daniel isn't here. Emily smiles, quieter. Margaret, yes. And sometimes silence makes us hear what we don't want to. Emily stares at her, feeling the weight of those words. The tension was palpable, but neither of them knew how to break it. Emily, Margaret, can I be honest? I've been feeling something different between us. Something hard to explain. Margaret, looking down, I thought it was just me, and I've blamed myself for it every day. The living room clock strikes midnight. Outside, the wind howls. 2 generations, 2 hearts in conflict, and a thin line about to be crossed. The night continued rainy in Springfield. Drops hit the glass as if they wanted to come in and watch what was happening inside. Margaret and Emily sat side by side with steam from the tea rising between them, like a small curtain of smoke that didn't hide what they both felt. Emily, I try not to think about it, but it's as if you're always here. Margaret, and I try to convince myself that it's wrong to feel something for you. You're so young, and you're my son's girlfriend. Emily, but the heart doesn't understand rules. Margaret took a deep breath. She was used to controlling emotions, to living within conventions. In the United States, where everything seemed measured and planned, career, family, appearances, this feeling was an unexpected crack in the perfect wall of her life. She observed Emily, sitting on the edge of the bed, with her hair still damp from the shower and a distant look. There was nothing deliberate about her beauty. It was natural, almost naive, and that's precisely what made it irresistible. Margaret, when Daniel was little, I taught him that love was always clear, always right. But now, I myself don't know what's right. Emily, maybe what's right is what's true, even if no one understands. The sound of thunder echoed, and the light flickered briefly. Margaret stood up and walked to the window. She looked outside, at the wet yard, at the distant lights of the sleeping American neighborhood. Everything seemed the same, and yet everything had changed. Margaret, Emily, do you understand what this means? If someone finds out, if Daniel discovers... Emily, I know, but I can't keep pretending nothing is happening. Since the first dinner, I noticed your gaze. It made me feel seen, in a way no one ever has. Margaret whispers, you shouldn't say that. Emily, but it's the truth. Silence returned. Only the sound of rain filled the room. And then, in a hesitant gesture, Margaret touched Emily's hand, not with boldness, but with tenderness. Emily didn't pull back. On the contrary, she intertwined their fingers as if responding without needing words. For an instant, time stopped. There was no mother, daughter-in-law, no guilt. There were only two people trying to understand a feeling that didn't fit in their world. Margaret, I don't know where this will lead us. Emily, neither do I, but maybe, for once, we can stop running away. The clock showed 1 a.m. when Margaret turned off the lamp. The tea grew cold on the table, and what remained was the sound of their breathing, each lost in a sea of emotions they still didn't know how to name. Dawn in Springfield brought the familiar smell of coffee and the distant sound of a lawn mower. Margaret descended the stairs with slow steps, her heart still restless. Emily was already in the kitchen, wearing a loose shirt and preparing toast, as if nothing had happened. But the silence between them had a different weight, dense, complicit, dangerous. Margaret, did you sleep well? Emily, avoiding her gaze. More or less. I had strange dreams. Margaret, me too. They exchanged a shy smile, and for an instant, the world seemed simple again. But soon, they heard the sound of Daniel's car entering the garage. He was returning early from work. Margaret straightened her posture. Emily rushed to set the table. It was a return to normalcy, or at least the appearance of it. In American suburbs, everything seemed to revolve around that, appearing stable. Clean houses, polite smiles, happy families, even when hearts were in pieces. Daniel, good morning, what a nice smell. Mom, did you make coffee? Margaret, of course, dear, how was work? Daniel, exhausting, but I thought about taking Emily to the lake this weekend. Emily, forcing a smile. That would be great. While he spoke, Margaret and Emily exchanged brief glances, almost imperceptible. Every simple gesture, a glass passed, an accidental touch of fingers, seemed loaded with meaning. Margaret tried to act naturally, but felt her heart race every time Emily came close. The feeling hadn't disappeared with daylight. On the contrary, now it was more real, more dangerous. In the afternoon, while Daniel worked in the yard, Margaret found Emily on the porch. The autumn sun painted the sky golden, and the wind made leaves dance in the garden. Margaret, we need to talk. Emily, I know. Margaret, what happened last night shouldn't have happened. Emily, but it did. Margaret, and if he finds out? Emily, do you think I don't think about that every second? Margaret took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. In the United States, where everything had a name and category, this feeling didn't fit anywhere. It was love, desire, guilt, tenderness, all at the same time. Margaret, promise you won't say anything? Not a gesture, nothing he might notice. Emily, I promise, but don't ask me to pretend I don't feel it. The wind brought the distant sound of a porch chime, soft, almost sad. And there, between the rustling of leaves and the weight of the secret, Margaret realized there was no turning back. Whatever had begun that night was now part of their lives, like a constant shadow between right and forbidden. The following weeks passed with the precision of an American clock: work, dinners, church visits on Sundays. From the outside, everything seemed normal. But inside Margaret's house, there was constant tension, like a dissonant melody that only two people could hear. Emily tried to concentrate on her job at the local art school. She taught children to paint, talked about creative freedom, about following your heart. Ironically, something she herself couldn't do without guilt. Margaret, for her part, maintained the same calm smile as always, tended the garden, and participated in the neighborhood book club. But when no one was watching, she exchanged glances with Emily that said more than any book. Margaret, yesterday at dinner, I could barely look at you. He would have noticed. Emily, I noticed, and it hurt. But it's also the only way to protect what we have. Margaret, protect or hide. Emily, maybe both. Daniel, without realizing the true reason, began to notice something different. Emily seemed distracted, distant. Margaret, quieter than normal. One Saturday afternoon, while washing the car in the garage, he looked through the window and saw the two of them talking in the kitchen. laughing, as if sharing a secret. He didn't suspect anything, but felt a slight discomfort. The kind of feeling you don't understand, but it lingers there, hovering. At night, Margaret tried to distract herself watching a cooking show. It was an American reality show about perfect families making impeccable Thanksgiving dinners. But every fake dialogue and rehearsed smile seemed to mock her. Perfect families, she thought. Nothing more American and nothing more unreal. When Emily entered the room with loose hair and a book in her hands, the air seemed to change. Margaret tried to smile, but her heart beat hard. She knew that feeling could no longer be contained or erased. Emily, sometimes I think we should tell everything. Margaret, and destroy what's left of the family? Emily, but living in hiding is also a way of dying slowly. Margaret stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the yard illuminated by the moon. The same yard where, years ago, she watched her son play, run, grow. Now, the same space harbored a secret that could shatter everything. Margaret, Emily, if he finds out, I lose him. But if I lose you, I don't know if I survive. Emily, trembling voice. So we're trapped, aren't we? Margaret, trapped by what we feel, and by what we pretend not to feel. The living room clock struck 10 at night. Outside, the neighbor walked her dog. The sound of a radio played an old jazz song. America continued its course, orderly, predictable. While inside that house, two women lived an impossible story, sustained by glances and silences. Autumn arrived in Springfield with its intense colors. The streets were covered with golden leaves, and the air carried that smell of wood and damp earth that always precedes the cold. To any neighbor, the Reynolds house remained the same, organized, welcoming, typically American. But inside, what was once home began to become a minefield of secrets and restrained glances. Daniel began to notice small things. Emily, once talkative, now became easily distracted. Margaret, once attentive to every detail of the house, sometimes got lost in long silences before the window. There were no fights, no harsh words, just an invisible distance, like a crack that grows slowly. One Sunday morning, during breakfast, Daniel spoke without thinking. Daniel, you two have been spending a lot of time together lately. Funny, sometimes I think you understand each other better than she and I do. Margaret, swallowing hard. Ah, it's that Emily has been good company. It's nice to have someone interested in books, art. Emily, forcing a smile. Yeah, we talk a lot about that. Daniel, I just hope you're not planning to replace me. Laughs. The comment was light, almost a joke, but the laughter from Margaret and Emily sounded strange, without naturalness. Daniel noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. In the following days, Margaret tried to distance herself. She told herself it was the right thing. She avoided touching Emily's hand, avoided being alone with her. But the absence was an almost physical pain. The house seemed colder, the coffee more bitter, the afternoons longer. One night, Emily knocked on her bedroom door. Emily, I can't anymore. You avoid me, but that only hurts me. Margaret, I need to do this. If not, he'll notice. Emily, and when he notices, what will be left of us? Margaret, Emily, don't say that. Emily, I do, because I love you, Margaret. And I no longer know if I can pretend I don't. The words hung in the air, cutting through the silence. Margaret felt tears come, but didn't run away. Those 3 words, simple and forbidden, echoed louder than the wind blowing outside. Margaret, softly, you shouldn't say that. But thank you for making me feel alive again. Outside, the distant sound of a train crossed the city, that melancholic sound that always accompanied American dawns. It was as if the night itself knew that something was about to crumble. The next morning, Daniel left early for work. Margaret stood at the door, watching the car move away down the street covered with leaves. She knew the balance was unraveling. It was no longer a question of if they would be discovered, but when. The cold of November arrived early in Springfield. Mornings were covered by a thin fog, and the city lake reflected the pale gray of the sky. Margaret observed the garden covered with dead leaves and wondered if everything she lived with Emily was a kind of late autumn in her life, beautiful but destined to end. Emily came to the house less often. She said she was overloaded with school, but Margaret knew. The distancing was a desperate attempt to protect them both. Even so, every time the phone rang and she saw Emily's name on the screen, her heart raced. One afternoon, Daniel arrived from work earlier than usual. He had a serious look, different. He sat at the kitchen table in silence while Margaret washed the dishes. Daniel: "Mom, can I ask you something?" Margaret: "Of course, dear. What is it?" Daniel: "Emily has been acting strange, distant. Sometimes when I talk to her, she seems guilty." Margaret, stopping for a second: "Guilty? Why?" Daniel: "I don't know. But something changed between you two as well. You avoid looking at each other, talking. What happened?" The sound of water hitting the steel of the sink was the only noise. Margaret kept her gaze fixed on the plate she was washing, as if there lay the answer she didn't know how to give. Margaret: "Nothing, Daniel. Maybe you're just tired. Sometimes we imagine things." Daniel, sigh: "Maybe. But I know you, Mom. And I know her too." He stood up, kissed his mother's cheek, and went upstairs. Margaret stood still, motionless, hearing her son's footsteps echo through the staircase. She knew he was beginning to put the puzzle together. That night, Emily called. "Emily, he's suspicious, isn't he?" Margaret: "He is, and I can't lie anymore looking into his eyes." Emily: "So what are we going to do?" Margaret: "I don't know. But continuing like this will destroy him. And maybe us too." On the other end of the line, silence. It was the kind of silence that weighs more than 1,000 words, made of everything that cannot be said. Emily: "Margaret, if I leave, will you hate me?" Margaret: "Never. But I'll wait for you, even if it's in secret." Margaret hung up the phone and stared at the device for long minutes. On the wall, the clock showed almost midnight. Outside, the wind blew strong, and the neighborhood lights went out one by one. Inside that American house, only the 60-year-old woman remained, sitting alone at the kitchen table, waiting for a destiny she knew she couldn't control. Winter finally arrived in Springfield. The first snow covered the streets, and houses decorated for Christmas displayed colored lights that blinked in the darkness. It was the time when all families gathered, but in that house, the Christmas spirit seemed to have been lost. Margaret was preparing hot chocolate in the kitchen when she heard the sound of the door opening. Daniel entered hurriedly, his face pale and eyes wet. In his hand, he carried a cell phone, the same device Emily used. Daniel: "Mom, what is this?" Margaret: "What, my son?" Daniel, trembling voice: "These messages, I didn't want to believe it, but they're yours, aren't they?" Margaret felt the floor disappear. Her hands trembled, air left her lungs. The messages, simple, tender, discreet, were enough to reveal everything. The affectionate words, the times, the intimate tone that no friendship could justify. Margaret: "Daniel, let me explain." Daniel: "Explain what? That you, my mother, fell in love with my girlfriend?" The scream echoed through the silent house. Margaret tried to approach, but Daniel took a step back, as if her touch burned. Daniel: "When I saw you two together, I thought it was beautiful. I thought you liked each other as family. But this? How could you?" Margaret: "I didn't plan any of this, Daniel. I fought against it every day. But I'm human." Daniel: "Human? You destroyed my life." Tears flowed, mixing anger and sadness. Outside, neighbors hung Christmas ornaments. Inside the house, love and guilt collided like plates of ice. Margaret: "Daniel." She tried to leave. I begged her to stay. The fault is mine, not hers. Daniel: "It doesn't matter who to blame. Nothing will fix this." The sound of the door slamming echoed through the hallways. Margaret stood still, alone in the kitchen, with the smell of chocolate burning on the stove. The church bell in the distance struck 7 o'clock. It was the first night of winter, and the first time in decades that she felt truly old. Later, Emily appeared, her face worn. Emily. He knows, doesn't he? Margaret. He knows. Emily. What did he say? Margaret. Everything a son would say to a mother who hurt him. Emily sat down, her hands trembling. The silence that settled was no longer complicit. It was mourning. Mourning for an impossible love, for a broken family, for lives that would never be the same again. Margaret. I loved you, Emily. But maybe the price was too high. Emily. Love shouldn't hurt so much. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering everything in white, as if the world tried to hide the marks of what had just happened. 3 months passed since that night. Winter gave way to spring, and Springfield bloomed again. But inside Margaret, everything was still cold. Daniel had moved to Boston, accepting a position at a tech company. Emily had also left the city, going to teach art at a community school in Maine. The house, once full of laughter and the smell of coffee, was now just an echo of memories. Margaret spent her days tending the garden. The tulips grew strong, but she barely noticed them. The silence of the house was almost physical, a constant companion. The book club had ceased to be a distraction. The stories seemed pale compared to the real life she had lived. One morning, she received a letter. It wasn't from Daniel. It was from Emily. The envelope had the smell of the sea and small marks of blue ink in the corners. Margaret, I thought time would heal, but time only taught me to live with longing. Not a day goes by without thinking of you. Not as a lover, but as the woman who showed me what it is to feel something true. I hope Daniel forgives you one day. He deserves peace, and so do you. Margaret read and reread those lines until the paper began to wear. She cried, not from guilt, but from a new kind of sadness, that of acceptance. Sometimes, at night, she dreamed of the house full again. With Daniel laughing in the kitchen, Emily painting on the porch, and her serving coffee, as if nothing had happened. But upon waking, the only sound was that of birds and the ticking of the old clock. One summer afternoon, Margaret received a call. It was Daniel. Daniel. Mom, can we talk? Margaret. Voice choked. Of course, my son. Whenever you want. Daniel. Tomorrow. I'm coming to Springfield. She spent the rest of the day in silence, tidying the house as if expecting a long-lost visitor. The smell of cake returned to the kitchen, flowers were moved, and for the first time in months, she felt something like hope. The next day, Daniel arrived. He had a tired look, but there was no more anger. They sat on the porch, unhurried. Daniel. They were difficult months. I hated you, Mom, but I also thought about everything you did for me my whole life. Margaret. I hurt you, and if I could change the past, I would. Daniel. I know. I just want to move forward. Tears came, but this time they were light, liberating. Deep down, both knew that forgiveness was a process, not a word said, but a bridge built slowly. When he left, Margaret watched the car move away down the sunny street. Her heart still ached, but something inside her was, finally, at peace. Life went on, imperfect, silent, and real. 5 years passed. Life in Springfield followed its quiet course, and the city seemed different. Margaret now had completely white hair and a calmer look. She still lived in the same house, but the garden was different, more colorful, less symmetrical, as if reflecting a woman who had finally learned to accept what she couldn't control. Daniel had remarried to a journalist from Boston named Claire. The relationship between mother and son was, finally, normal again, mature, respectful, but with a light shadow of something that time didn't completely erase. One morning, Margaret received an unexpected letter. The sender said, Portland Art Gallery, Maine. Inside, an invitation to an exhibition called Portraits of Absence, signed by Emily Harper. She looked at the invitation for long minutes. Her heart, which for years had beaten at a calm rhythm, accelerated. And without telling anyone, she took the train to Portland. The gallery was small, cozy, full of paintings that seemed to speak about silence, loss, and love. And there she was, Emily, standing before a painting that portrayed a garden covered with white tulips under a gray sky. Emily turned her face, and for a second, time seemed to go back. the same sweet look, the same contained smile. But now there was something different. Maturity, serenity. Emily. You came. Margaret. Of course I came. I always wanted to see what time did to your art. Emily. And to us? Margaret. Smiles. Time painted on us too. With difficult colors, but true ones. They walked through the gallery, looking at the paintings. Neither needed to say much. The canvases spoke for them. There was a painting of two female figures walking in opposite directions under the snow, and in the lower corner, a painted note. Not all love needs to last to be eternal. Emily. That was the last thing I painted before leaving Springfield. Margaret. It's beautiful. It hurts a little, but it's beautiful. They stood in silence, side by side, watching the colors blend on the canvases. The blue of longing, the red of love, the gray of regret. Margaret. Are you happy? Emily. In a different way. I found myself. And you? Margaret. Me too. I think finally I learned to forgive you, him, and myself. A simple hug closed what words couldn't. There was no more guilt, no secrets. Just two women who had loved each other at the wrong time and place, and who now recognized each other with tenderness and respect. When they said goodbye, the sun began to set over Portland, tinting the sea orange and gold. Margaret walked to the train station with a light heart, carrying with her the feeling that sometimes life gives us a second ending to the same love, not to relive it, but to understand it. Winter returned to Springfield, as it always did. The same cold, the same silence in the mornings, the same smell of coffee mixed with wood burning in fireplaces. But inside Margaret's house, the cold no longer frightened. Now it was part of the landscape. A soft memory of everything that had already been lost and, in a way, found again. The photograph of Daniel and Claire decorated the shelf. The couple smiled, embraced, with their newborn first child in their arms. Margaret looked at that image with serene pride. Her son had remade his life, and she, somehow, had too. On the living room table lay a letter. It had come from Maine, written in Emily's unmistakable handwriting. The envelope carried only one sentence on the back. The tulips are blooming again. Margaret smiled. She knew what that meant. She grabbed her coat, went out to the yard, and stood looking at her own flower bed, the same one she had cultivated for decades. White tulips were beginning to sprout under the cold, stubborn and alive, like the love that had once been forbidden, but never ceased to be real. Margaret, thinking, life is made of seasons. None lasts forever, but all leave something. Over time, she became a beloved figure in the neighborhood. Children called her Mrs. M, and she liked to prepare cookies for community parties. When they asked about her youth, she smiled and said only, I live the kind of love that teaches more than it hurts. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, Margaret sat on the porch with a blanket over her shoulders, watching the sky change color. And on certain days, she thought she heard Emily's distant laughter, echoing in some corner of memory, light, sweet, untouched by time. In the last letter she received, months later, Emily had written, The past doesn't need to be a burden, Margaret. Sometimes it's just a reminder that we love truly, and to love, even if only once, is what gives meaning to life. Margaret folded the letter carefully, placed it inside a poetry book, and closed her eyes. Outside, snow began to fall, silent, soft, covering the garden like a promise of peace. Life had been imperfect, yes, but looking back, she realized something simple and profound. Even among mistakes, fears, and goodbyes, she had loved and been loved. And that, she thought, was enough.